The radio crackled at 4:47 in the afternoon, and Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt went cold. He was already 600 meters up the slope of Dong Ap Bia, a mountain the maps barely bothered naming, in a corner of the Shau Valley that the army had largely ignored for 2 years, and his men had been fighting uphill for 3 days without taking the top. Now, through the smoke and the sound of his own battalion's M16 fire, the voice on the radio was telling him what the sky already showed. The Air Force had just put napalm on the wrong grid, not on the NVA bunkers above. On the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry's own assault element, partway up the ridge. The strike burned through the canopy and found American soldiers. Honeycutt knew the casualty figure before the medevac birds even lifted. He knew, too, that he would order another assault the next morning. The hill was still there, the NVA were still in it, and nobody above him had told him to stop. That was May 14, 1969. There were 6 more days of fighting left on Dong Ap Bia. By the time it was over, it had a new name, one that the men who climbed it gave it, not the generals who ordered them up. And the argument over whether a single hill in the Shau Valley was ever worth the price of taking it had become, for a brief and furious moment, the argument over the entire war. The Shau Valley sits roughly 50 kilometers southwest of Hue, pressed up against the Laotian border, and in 1969 it was one of the most strategically loaded pieces of terrain in South Vietnam. The valley floor ran north-south for about 25 kilometers, and the NVA had been using it as a major logistics corridor, a southern extension of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that funneled men and materiel toward the populated coastal lowlands. MACV had largely ceded the Shau after a special forces camp there fell to an NVA assault in 1966, and the enemy had spent the intervening 3 years turning it into a well-developed base area. Roads, supply caches, anti-aircraft positions, and fortified high ground. By the spring of 1969, the 101st Airborne Division had been ordered back into the valley as part of Operation Apache Snow, a sweep designed to find and destroy NVA forces and supply infrastructure before they could threaten Hue again. The operation called for 5 battalions operating across a broad front, pushing into the high ground on the western edge of the valley. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, call sign Rakkasans, drew the sector that included Dong Ap Bia. At 937 meters, it was the highest feature in the immediate area of operations. Nobody expected it to be held in strength. The intelligence picture suggested light contact, maybe a screening force. The intelligence picture was wrong. Weldon Honeycutt was 39 years old in May 1969 and had been soldiering for nearly 2 decades. He was a combat veteran of Korea, a hard-driving lieutenant colonel who ran his battalion with little patience for hesitation and less for excuses. His men called him Tiger, some affectionately, some not, and his professional reputation was as a commander who pushed the mission and expected his subordinates to keep up. He had served in Vietnam before, and he had come back for a second tour with the confidence of a man who believed he understood the war at the level where it was actually fought, down in the dirt and the tree lines, not in the briefing rooms at MACV headquarters in Saigon. What was riding on Apache Snow for Honeycutt personally was simple: results. The 101st Airborne's new commanding general, Major General Melvin Zais, had put a premium on aggressive action. Honeycutt had no reason to think a contact on a remote mountain peak in Tua Thien province would be anything other than a manageable fight. Specialist 4th Class Harlan Giles was not thinking about strategy. He was 20 years old, from Texas, and he was in Charlie Company 387th, one of the rifle companies that would go up the hill first. He had been in country long enough to know what a cold LZ felt like versus a hot one, and long enough to distrust the casual optimism that sometimes came down from battalion. On the other side of the wire, or rather, on the other side of several hundred meters of contested jungle ridgeline, the NVA's 29th Regiment had been on Dong Ap Bia for months. They had built it. Interconnected bunker systems, mutually supporting fighting positions, overhead cover designed to absorb the kind of air and artillery prep that American doctrine relied on to suppress a position before the infantry went in. The 29th Regiment's commander understood the terrain perfectly. His men were dug in at multiple levels of the mountain, and the thick canopy overhead limited the effectiveness of airstrikes and made it nearly impossible for the Americans to map the exact dimensions of what they were about to walk into. On paper, when the 3 187th's lead elements made first contact on the lower slopes of Dong Ap Bia on May 10th, it looked like a problem that firepower could solve. There was just one problem. The firepower wasn't reaching the bunkers. May 10th, Alpha and Charlie companies air assaulted into the valley floor and began moving uphill. They made contact within hours, NVA small arms and RPG fire from concealed positions in the thick vegetation. The companies pulled back, called in air and artillery, and tried again. The prep seemed to do damage. But when the infantry moved back up, the NVA were still there. In the same positions or ones nearby, May 11th, Honeycutt pushed harder. Two companies attacking simultaneously up different ridges, coordinating by radio, trying to find an angle the NVA bunker network couldn't cover. The NVA let them get close and then opened up with interlocking fire from positions the artillery had largely missed. Charlie Company took severe casualties on a spur below the summit. The companies pulled back again. By May 12th, Honeycutt had a clearer picture of what he was fighting, and it was larger than the initial intelligence had suggested. The 29th Regiment was not a screening force. It was dug in for a deliberate defense, and the mountain's terrain, steep ridges, dense canopy, ground fog in the mornings was working in their favor at every point. Airstrikes were running into targeting problems. The jungle absorbed artillery, and the only way to clear the NVA off Dong Ap Bia was to go up and dig them out, bunker by bunker, which meant sending men straight into the fire. He requested additional assets and kept attacking. May 14th, the Fratricide Airstrike hit an assault element near the upper slopes. The number of casualties from this specific strike varies in different accounts. Some sources cite approximately 7 killed and 53 wounded among American forces from all fratricide and fire coordination incidents across the battle. The precise toll from this single May 14th strike alone is not firmly established in the sources I have available. Please verify before including a specific figure in the final script or flag it as approximate. The strike did not stop the assault. Honeycutt reported it up the chain, absorbed the losses, and ordered the next phase. By now the hill had acquired its name. The troops called it Hamburger Hill, the place that ground men up like meat. The name spread fast, the way gallows humor does in a unit that has been taking casualties for 5 straight days. What happened in the next 6 days would determine whether that name was a footnote or a headline. May 15th through 18th, reinforcements arrived. The 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, another 101st Unit, was committed to the fight, with elements of the 2nd Battalion, 501st Infantry joining as well. A South Vietnamese battalion, the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Regiment of the ARVN 1st Division, was inserted on the western slopes to close off the Laotian escape routes and prevent resupply. The operation was now a multi-battalion effort, and Honeycutt remained the primary driver of the assault. The pattern repeated daily: prep fires, infantry assault up the ridgelines, heavy contact, casualties, pull back, more prep fires. The NVA's bunker system was built on the assumption that American attackers would follow the natural terrain, the ridges, and it covered those avenues of approach with overlapping fields of fire. The jungle was so thick that men sometimes couldn't see 3 meters in front of them. Units got turned around in the fog and the vegetation. Radio communications were difficult. Coordination between parallel assault elements was imprecise. Chaplain, Captain Charles Waters, who was with the 505th Parachute Infantry, attached to the broader operation, was seen on the slopes during some of the heaviest fighting, moving in the open to reach wounded men under fire. His actions across this period of the battle were documented by multiple witnesses. Waters' Medal of Honor was awarded for actions at Dak 2 in 1967, not Hamburger Hill. I flagged this in the Stage 1 table as being from a different battle and should not have carried him into this script. Please confirm whether you want a different figure cited here for a similar chaplain medic role at Hamburger Hill specifically, or if you would prefer to remove this reference entirely to keep the cast accurate to this battle. I will not fabricate a confirmed witness to Hamburger Hill to fill this narrative slot, May 20th. The final assault went in with all available assault elements pushing from multiple directions simultaneously. The NVA had been absorbing air and artillery for 10 days. The 29th Regiment had taken severe casualties of its own, and some elements had begun to withdraw through the western exit onto the Laotian border. The route, the ARVN element, had been placed to close, though with imperfect effect. By mid-morning on May 20th, American and ARVN forces had broken through the bunker lines and reached the summit of Dong Ap Bia. The mountain was taken at approximately 10 in the morning. The cost: 72 Americans killed in action across the 10 days of fighting and approximately 372 wounded. The NVA's 29th Regiment suffered an estimated 630 killed, though like all such figures from this theater, that number carries the uncertainty of battlefield body counts. The 187th Infantry alone suffered some of the heaviest casualty rates of any American battalion in a single engagement during 1969. The hill, once taken, was held briefly and then abandoned. There was no strategic need to garrison it permanently. The NVA moved back in within weeks. The decision to take Hamburger Hill, and the decision to keep attacking it for 10 straight days after it became clear what it would cost, produced the sharpest public backlash of any single battle of the war to that point. Senator Edward Kennedy took the floor of the Senate on May 20th, the same day the hill was secured, and called the battle senseless and irresponsible, a phrase that found its way into every newspaper in the country. MaxiV's official defense that the operation had destroyed a major NVA base area and inflicted heavy casualties did not land well in a political environment already marked by skepticism about body counts as a metric of progress. Hamburger Hill became a touchstone in the American debate over what the war in Vietnam actually was, and what winning it could possibly mean in a way that few individual battles had managed before it. Weldon Honeycutt was promoted to full colonel in 1970. He retired from the army as a colonel in 1971. His handling of the Hamburger Hill assault was reviewed by his superiors and found to be within the parameters of his orders and consistent with the tactical situation as understood at the time. He maintained for the rest of his life that the 387th had done exactly what it was asked to do. He died in 2009. Major General Melvin Zais, the 101st Airborne's commanding general who approved the continued assault, defended the operation publicly in a widely read interview in 1969. Arguing that the battle had cost the NVA far more than it had cost the Americans in any metric that mattered militarily. He retired as a 4-star general in 1976. The men of the 187th Infantry, the 1506th, and the other units committed to Dong Ap Bia carried the memory of the hill the way soldiers carry the memory of the place that marked them. Not as a story about winning or losing, but as a 10-day argument with a mountain that the mountain seemed, for a long time, to be winning. They named it themselves. The generals didn't give it that name. The men who went up it did. That detail is worth holding on to. If you found this story interesting, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you learned something new, and leave a comment telling me which overlooked operation or battle from the Vietnam War you think deserves its own video. This video that dramatizes real historical events and real historical figures. Some dialogue, interior thought, and sensory reconstruction have been added for storytelling purposes. Troop movements, casualty figures, and documented outcomes are drawn from after-action records, unit histories, and published military histories of the battle. Where specific figures are uncertain, this has been noted. This is not a verbatim historical record. It is a cinematic reconstruction based on one.